We've been reaching out to individual papaya, to the associations, and through that. But rather than to to call everyone we know who's doing papaya, we have been talking to the landowners. We just haven't seen that connection. And there's probably maybe 7 or 8 large landowners who are leasing to the papaya industry, and then the dairy is the other one that, and they're primarily on state. I guess they have some other leasing as well for them to file on. So that we've had conversations and encouraging them to do that. So just as far as the Commission is concerned, know that the registration process, the required registration for GMO is in process. The voluntary registration or invitation to register your farming activities also possible. I'm really not sure how practical that's going to be, whether every farmer on the Kona coast is going to give you a paper that you already fill out. You guys fill out federal NAS stuff. I mean, your farmers do that, right? They all get these things from the National Ag Statistics.
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Yeah, right. So there's that. And there's some discussion that maybe in the real property tax part of registering your tax exemption, you might get some additional data collection opportunity for the county.
Is there a point person for the GMO registration right now?
Right now it's Don Mendy at the, what I think,
Deputy Director of
R&D. And he is, so we're working on trying to get out and get that outreach, but we just encourage you to participate in that as well.
Okay, did you have your questions answered, or do you have any?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Thank you. So then, I think that agenda item is well covered. I think, Jeff, you want to bring up Council Bill 185, organic farm property tax exemption, maybe some other tax issues too.
Yeah, just the Councilman Iligan submitted 185, which there was a little bit of press on, trying to get a specific tax adjustment, real property tax adjustment for folks who are organically growing. It's kind of a tinkering bill. It kind of just touches one little piece of the ag story and was trying to give it some kind of different structure. There are lots of difficulties in that process, and for the most part, what the council said was they sent it to this task force that that councilperson Willie and Fresh and 3 others are chairing. So that's kind of where those bills have gone. There are several others in the tax world, some things related to other kinds of exemptions, and rather than to take them one at a time, they're trying to deal with them in a bigger way. And I think what I think we will see here, and I just want to put the commissioners on notice, that at some point, the administration needs to step back, or we're working on trying to come up with a broader approach to the overall ag tax exemption program, so that we don't come at it with little pieces, but kind of take a bigger look at it. And so that's in process. There are conversations and work's been going on for a year or so, just kind of thinking about that as we can get time to do that in finance and real property. So it may be that in your next meeting or subsequent meeting, some of that can come here for testing with you folks in terms of here's some ideas, here's some thoughts and some directions that might be doable to accomplish in a reasonable period of time about the real property tax stuff, the ag exemption. It's about $34 million a year that the county does not collect because we break the tax exempt value and the use value. And I think there's a general understanding that some of that's very appropriate and right on key, and there's others of it that are kind of taken advantage of in different ways that maybe need to be looked at again. So taking that bigger look and coming to this group as a test place for some of that thinking is probably on your horizon. So I just wanted to put that in front of you. So when we make an agenda, I'm not sure, I got a note from Finance Director this morning asking when your next meeting was, and I gave her a response to that, but she's kind of thinking about this as a test place, as a place just to kind of in a good way test our own ability to explain it, test your responses to different ideas. We won't come with a fixed thing, come up with some alternatives and some thoughts, and see what that is.
Okay. So we can expect next meeting or a meeting shortly thereafter, a look at not just the organic tax exemption, but like a look at all the agricultural tax exemption. Kind of an overview.
Yeah, we won't, I mean, I think that bill is kind of off on the side now with the other piece. We won't kind of go at that one specifically. We'll kind of look at it in a larger context.
And just to summarize, the organic tax exemption, basically, how much is it exempt? What's the requirements for
I think what, this is, I'm trying to read into what I think Councilman Gilligan had in mind, was for people who were certified organic, that currently any kind of, that they would be comparable to some kind of pasture rate. Right now you have a rate at orchard rate, you have a nursery rate, you have a pasture rate, you have a forestry rate. There are like 4 different categories of those. You have intensive ag, orchard, field crops and fast rotation forestry, pasture, and he was going to add certified organic into that category, but it would be, he was trying to get it at a lower rate. And there's some issues about separating out organic farming from other farming and saying, is that fair, is that a reasonable thing to do? And how would you know whether they were organic? You made the comment to me the other day that you can file for your organic certification on your farm and it can take months, and how do you know whether you are every year? You have to reapply for it every year, and then you lose your certification, you lose that exemption. So I mean, there's some difficulties with it, but it was his effort to try and throw that issue on the table and see what would happen to it. So I don't know that we'll come back and talk about that one specifically, but we'll try to talk about the bigger picture.
Okay,
the bigger picture.
I guess is there any further discussion on Council Bill 195? Other council members? No, again, farm property tax exemption. Okay, consider that part of the agenda covered. The next was a discussion on Implementation of Act 203, and that was one which I found what Maui was doing with it, so I gave that packet to everyone so they could see what Maui's come up with. I think what I got from our last meeting is just because you have your building permit as an exempt, doesn't mean you don't need a fire, safety, a plumbing, and electric. And what I'd like to try and do is collect from people in the public, what buildings, can we get further exemptions? Is there a way for, possibly give advice to the mayor, say if it's a certain size building with a small amount of, a hose going to it and maybe a solar panel, are there certain buildings that we should say should be exempt from both fire, electricity, plumbing, and see if we can't come up with a list of like, these buildings no problem with, these buildings you need this type of permits, and these buildings you need a further process. So basically that's an area which I'd like to explore, because I think the way that the act is being implemented right now, kind of from the public point of view, it says, oh, building permit, I don't need any permit. And some people want to put things up, and it's still just as illegal as it was before. It's just one of the many permits that they don't have. So that's what basically that's what I'm trying to like people from the public and see if they have specific buildings that they'd like to see, basically either pre-approved or pre-approved for the exemption.
Maybe our council can help clarify this for me, but I thought that was the process that we were trying to do before our commission term ended the last time, when we reached out to various groups asking them what buildings should be exempt. And my understanding was that period was closed from the county side. I don't know if anybody else recalls, since September 2012, I think, that we were having that discussion. So I don't know if we have the ability to still come up with a list of buildings that should be exempt. I thought if we did it by that certain date, then the state dated maybe.
Well, you're right, what happened, and then the legislature passed different bills the following year that listed out what would be exempt. So I think the statute itself has a list.
Do you have the reference for that?
No. I'll have to pull it up, but I think the statute that passed, I sent these to you, I think, when we were going through this, or the legislative history of it, so I'd have to go back and look. quite certain that it was a bill passed subsequent to the one we were working on that actually listed the.
Right, there's more specifics on it.
Yep. Yeah, so I don't know if we can add to it. I think there's a lot on the list already, but I think they're trying to figure out how to implement the statute.
Yeah, I think working on the implementation, and you're looking at saying, well, this is only the building permit, the other ones. That's where I see confusion.
That's absolutely right. People don't realize that this is not an exemption from all permits, but rather just the building permit only. And that doesn't, and it does not speak to requirements for insurance, for fire safety, I mean, all of that. There's a whole bunch of other things that still come into play. And if it's a processing facility, all of the requirements for a commercial kitchen, or a certified kitchen come into play. So that's not an exemption either. So people do have to realize that though it's agricultural related, there's still other triggers for other permits that are not exempted through that statute.
That's correct.
Yeah, I guess, okay, but yeah, I didn't get any, people in the public bring in anything extra. And I just figure we might keep abreast of it as the rules are formed, like Maui's always formed their application, see what we're doing with this state, and doing with this county, and see if it's making sense to, it's usable, basically. I guess this really does move into the next part, if there's any legislative update on any other bill that was related to it.
So my understanding when Neil Erickson came to talk to us last, he was starting the process modeling after the Maui Declaration, and he was looking for comments from us on that process. And let me read in the minutes. But he kind of wanted to wrap up, completing his exemption form and handouts, I think, in the next month or two. So I don't know if the other commissioners recall that, but I think that's where we left off, that he was looking for our comments. And so what Dot sent around, I couldn't determine if this is what you pulled or what Neil sent.
No, that's what I found. And
Okay.
I figured that was kind of the best model we had, Jason.
But when we met with Neil last month, he actually had a draft, right, that he kind of passed around, and I thought he said he was going to send it to staff.
Okay.
He was going to, but I didn't get it.
So maybe,
So basically, maybe what we should do is see when his draft comes in, we have this kind of as a guideline, just kind of a reference material for all of us. When his draft comes in, then that would be an appropriate time to say, well, can you add on the county level exemption from, other exemptions too for certain buildings, certain size buildings, and, keep on shaping it. That would be the basic for comments.
Chair, if I can make a suggestion, if we can ask R&D staff to get a couple of things for us, and that would be the second bill that David mentioned was passed in the 2013 legislative session. I don't know how we was trying to reference.
That's Act 203.
So it's,
Right.
the Act 203 was that second one that passed after we were going through,
Okay.
we worked on an earlier act
Okay,
that then was superseded by Act 203.
okay. And then if one of you could follow up with Neil on what he's drafted, if he wants to watermark it draft, if he's not super comfortable yet, but I think it would be good if our commission could respond directly to what he's creating for County of Hawaii. And I think he was looking for that comment from us, but we just didn't get the document to comment on.
So we don't have anything to comment on.
Right.
Right.
So okay, I think that makes a lot of sense. And
My response would be, that's good, and I think that this is obviously an issue that comes up a lot in the ag community. I was interested in your presence here and the kind of questions you're getting at the council level for this. And right now, at our last meeting, it was quite, I don't know, to me, it wasn't clear at the end of that if I really understood what it is what they would or they wouldn't permit or not permit, and there wasn't like a comprehensive list, so kind of it depends was one of the, kind of what I felt like at the end of that. But so understanding the kind of things that you think ought to be is not a bad list to create. I think keeping this on your agenda is a good thing. It helps to keep an organized place in which they need to come and have a conversation with a commission and encourage them to ripen that up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think especially going from the draft seems like that should be our, focal point. It makes a lot of sense. Most of the stuff that you have to think about could be addressed at that point, actually making a permit. So.
And at the last meeting, Mr. Erickson did indicate if you want his presence at the next meeting, you need to make sure Deputy Director Brandon Gonzalez, you make that request, through R&D to Mr. Brandon Gonzalez to request Neil Erickson's presence at this committee meeting.
Yes.
And that's just,
That's just part of it.
yeah.
So, yes, and I think so if this committee wants to continue to play a role in this conversation by, being a foil or a back and forth in it, then I think that's good. And we'll just put it on the agenda and we'll try to get Neil to the next one. Because it's a HELO meeting, easier for him to get to.
And, just make reference to whether he has a draft.
Right, I think we should make sure we have a draft.
Yeah, and then show him this too, the one from now.
Easton.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Okay.
I guess you got that.
Chair, can I ask?
Yeah.
May
He's the chair.
I'm check.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Regards to why I'm here is we're getting calls, or we have been getting calls. It's spawned by a newspaper advertisement, I think in November, that said Act 203 would be discussed in the December meeting. And so, when I say the public, it's those that are calling, small representation of the public. But there's a lot of confusion. They don't know, and they don't know where to go. They go to the planning department, and they may get any number of whoever comes to the counter to help, and they don't know how to answer the question. In one case, they're told, we don't have a process. So the response is, you have a state law that says you can do this now. So what is the county of Hawaii doing to give us the information we need to implement or to do? So that's the reason I'm here, because I've got people, they couldn't make it. We thought about the meeting for later, or the one in Hilo as well. So I thought I'd come away with something so I could tell them. I'm not sure now from the conversation here what this body would do to aid that, answer that question. Or is there somebody we can direct them to that knows, and can they go ahead and do this or not? I don't know.
There is one person.
I'm looking for some guidance. Is that right?
This person who came to brief us.
Neil Erickson.
Neil Erickson in the building department.
And is he in Hilo?
Yes.
Yeah.
But, if you call Neil, that's, what he said to us was, ask those questions of me. He's the point person on this issue.
Okay.
And it's not a planning issue, it's a building department issue, so planning.
That's right, my mistake.
Yeah. But I would say Neil is the person who's going to be best in answering that question. But even when he was doing it for us, it was still a little hard to get the full picture.
So, and people are asking the very questions you just posed over. Suppose you have a water spigot to run it to a greenhouse.
Right, we need the public.
You did, according to that, yeah. You need so,
Or do you have a 12-volt PV on top of your building to run a small pump?
yeah.
You need electrical permit to put a 12-volt PV in a small.
So I would like a place to refer them to, and this is Neil, and the public can call Neil, get the specific,
That'd be most direct.
move ahead. Okay, that's
Yeah,
good.
because we're basically giving advice to Neil and giving advice to the mayor. And so we'll probably see that at a draft level, possibly before they do the public, and try and put some input in it. It sounds like the input we're trying to put in is the same input that people ask. But is this going to fly? Basically.
If I can just add, so my understanding when Neil met with us last month was he's trying to come up with the implementation process for basically the interface with the public. So what he has is a draft process that someone would have to follow to get the exemption. So there still is going to be a process, is our basic understanding. It sounded like he needed deputy and maybe even director to still approve his process. So that's what we're providing feedback on, is the process he's coming up with. So it's still a work in progress from what I understand. It's
So to the
best
best of
summary.
your knowledge, can somebody go to DPW now and go ahead and,
Get an exemption.
yeah? Or do we have to wait for a process, do you know that? Or is that?
I believe they
that's
have
for
to
them
develop
answer?
their
Yeah,
internal
I
process.
said they don't have a form like, Maui's form like
Yeah,
this.
that's pretty, they have their hands on that.
But call Neil and he could probably
Okay.
better explain it.
Thank you very much.
And the other thing would be to pull down a copy of Act 203 for yourself
I have it.
and be able to send that to them, because the bill does say certain things. And then basically, most of what this is a need to register after it's already constructed.
Absolutely.
So people are cautious about going in there and doing, starting and then not knowing what they need. But frankly, the registration, as it's written in the state law, says within 30 days from the time you complete the building, whatever that means, complete the building, you're supposed to register it. So it's a tough one. It's a tough interface of government actions that aren't really clear, and that's what I think this commission would be helpful in being a voice back and forth in this conversation. That's what I.
Well, that's a good point, because some of them are coming in, they've had their buildings for years. And
It's
now
not,
they want to
it
be
doesn't
compliant.
apply to grandfather buildings prior to, I think, July 1st, 2013. Yeah,
But these
So-
are probably built without any,
so they can't get an exemption for something that's 5 or 10 years old.
no, okay.
It's not.
Is that
And you
an
can clarify
actual-
that with Neil.
Okay, thank you.
But basically, what Jeff is saying is, yes, the law does say come within 30 days of completion. What Neil is trying to do is encourage people to come before they build, so they get a very clear understanding of what the exemption can and can't apply to. Like, you're still gonna need a plumbing permit, you'll still need electrical, and even though it's exempt, it's still supposed to meet code. So Neil's trying to do education up front, so it's kind of like a step more than the law. So I think that's where he's trying to determine, does he have that flexibility to roll out a program that says, hey, come talk to us before you build, because the law says you don't have to talk to us until 30 days after you complete. But he's still trying to provide some education in there, so that's why the process is a little topsy-turvy.
Well said, well said.
Okay, well, you helped clarify some.
There are two other things. One of the things the planning department is that the setback issue, because these things don't go through planning normally, I mean, as they would normally, the setback issue can trap people by just putting the building too close to the boundary. Planning would tell them that. And the other thing is if they're building within the SMA, if they're building down in an SMA location, which it doesn't exempt them from SMA. So those things are the part of the unanticipated sausage-making process at the state legislature that put this together when it was done.
So people think they have a free pass to just make a building, and then you find out, oh wait, these 10 other things still
It
apply.
depends.
Yeah.
Right, it depends, right?
Yeah.
It's the standard answer in the planning department, right, Mark?
No, they just need to know the rules.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so that's what we're looking for, the rules. Okay, thank you.
So,
Thank you very much.
what I'm taking from this is that we will invite Neil via Brandon to attend the next meeting as part of, and keep an update process.
And then also in his draft.
And ask him to provide a draft of the guidelines of the process, whatever it looks like.
Yeah, I think it would be nice if we provided that we have the draft and we actually kind of focus a little more on our comments on the draft to it, which probably is going to happen anyhow.
Yeah, no, I think you're right.
But that way we have a place and the people are actually going to see when it goes to exemption, we'll know whether, give us some feedback or we'll even work it out.
Okay.
Okay, so I think next item on the agenda is the legislative update.
Thank you, Dot, she's not here, but thanks to Dot for sending out the Ag Bill update that I prepared yesterday. I wanted to wait until after the legislature took action on Friday and then posted all the results, because Friday was a deadline, an internal deadline called first lateral. And if bills don't make that first lateral deadline, then they're no longer a viable bill. So I was trying to reduce the number of bills that I could report on. There's still a lot of them, lots and lots and lots. And the numbers will decrease precipitously in the coming weeks because we're hitting some deadlines coming up. The first lateral is when the bills have to pass out of all of their initial committees and be in their final committee on the referral. If you remember, one of the columns, if you have the either last meeting's list in front of you or the one I just sent, it has a list of referrals and the three-letter acronym for the committees, and there's usually a comma in between. That means if there's, like, for example, EEP, comma, CPC, that means it's a double referral. It has to go from one to the next. And so all the bills have to be in their final committee now, or they're no longer viable. The list is very long, in part because this is the second year of a biennium, so every bill that was still alive after last session and passed first lateral last session is still viable. So they can still come up. That's why there's a whole bunch of bills in here that are dated, last action was February 2013. As long as they passed first lateral during last year, they're still viable this year for action. So that's why they're included in your list. But the next deadline is going to be on the 28th of this month. That Friday is what's called first decking. If bills don't make first decking, then they don't make... First decking means basically you take all the bills and make it out of final committee and put it on the deck, put it on the office, on the desk of the legislators in the chamber. They have basically a week to review all of those bills, vote on them, and then if they pass, then they cross over to the other side. First crossover of all bills is on March 6th. So you see there's 1 week between first decking and first cross. So after the first crossover, we're going to have half of these gone. Half of these won't even be in here, at least, because they just won't survive. That's when it's clear that one chamber doesn't support a bill, and often the last committee is either finance, so there's no money for it, so it's not going to go anywhere, or it's judiciary, which means if it doesn't pass out of judiciary, people aren't agreeing with whatever changes you're making to the criminal code or the civil code, you know, that relate to it, or CPC, Consumer Protection and Commerce, or the equivalent in the Senate. And if you don't pass out of that, which is usually the second committee, that means there's not enough support for something that is directly related to consumer protection, and labeling, for example, is one of those issues. So while the list is very long now, it will get shorter quickly. So at our next meeting, this will be about half the size. So this is a very active time at the legislature. There's a couple of bills in this 38 pages that I'll just highlight. And some that there's a lot more in here. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but there are some bills that relate to taxation. You know, for example, there's a tax credit for important agricultural land. There's a couple of bills that actually identify what are permitted uses in important agricultural lands.
Those real property tax credits or income tax credits?
This is, let me pull it up. Clarifies the amount of the important agricultural land qualified for agricultural cost tax credit. Must be a state, it's not a real property. There's a number of bills in here about the little fire ants, and a number of bills about invasive species. Little fire ants, the bills relate to you know, a pilot project for how to set up and train a canine detection team and have a pilot project related to that. Do a public awareness and education outreach about little fire ants and appropriation for that. There's also bills related to invasive species that include everything from setting up appropriating funding for the Hawaii Invasive Species Council for all of their work. And there's another bill that relates to appropriations for setting up facilities at all ports to handle inspection to prevent invasive species from moving among the islands. So that seems to be a very important topic that's moving through the legislature as well. GMO labeling and GMO-related legislation is moving. There's several different ones. One of them is a labeling bill. And another one is a task force, establishing a task force to determine whether a state-established regulatory regime should be established to address agricultural use of genetically modified organisms. That bill, for example, is the one that people talked about where the state legislature is seeking to establish primacy, that they actually would preempt county legislation or county ordinance related to regulation of genetically modified organisms. That bill is not to establish primacy to preempt, but to establish a task force to determine whether a state regulatory regime should be established to address GMO issues. So my guess is that that's the bill that's probably going to move. There was a lot of pilikia after the initial bill was introduced about direct preemption, and that didn't move out of committee. Chair Nishihara, who's the Agricultural Committee Chair in the Senate, said there wasn't enough support to move that out, so he moved out the task force bill. I expect that's probably going to move this session. That bill, for example, is going to have a decision-making tomorrow.
What's the number now?
That GMO task force regulation SB 2454, and that's on page 32 of this document. As I said, there's a number of GMO labeling bills. They're alive, but they're not all going to move. Let's see, there's other bills related to coffee labeling, for example, increasing the penalties for false labeling of coffee, there's a couple of other bills having to do with coffee labeling. I don't know if and if there are bills that are related to your particular commodity group that aren't in here, or they are in here and they're priority, if you let me know, then I can actually provide you with more detailed information about those particular bills that are of interest to your commodity group or to your property. Oh, and just a couple last things, and then I'll go to questions. There's several farm-to-school bills in here as well. One to establish a coordinator in the DOE to try to set that up. There's other ones that expand a GET exemption. It's the agricultural commodities GET exemption, and it expands it to other products. So as I say, there's some tax-related bills. Finally, some appropriation bills. The Commonwealth Vacuum Cooling Plant is going in for financial support. That bill is still alive. There's appropriations for the Waimea Pauwila Watershed Project. That's still moving. There's a couple of financing bills, special purpose revenue bond. There's a bill to there's a bill to allow special purpose revenue bond financing for private landowners or private owners of dams and reservoirs. So you remember from our previous discussion, dams and reservoirs are a huge issue. There's often, it's very expensive to decommission them or to bring them into compliance. And so to help finance those, the legislature is considering having special purpose revenue bond financing available if a private landowner wants to utilize those. So there's a bill moving through to authorize SPURBs, special purpose revenue bonds, to be used for dams and reservoirs. And finally, there's some funding for agriculture-related projects on other islands. I won't go into those. Oh, and then we may have heard a briefing on BioTorque. It's a private company that is taking papaya waste and trying to create fuel from it on this island. It's a private company working in conjunction with Dennis Gonzalez, with PBARC. And they have a business, this BioTorque, where they have a microorganism that will help break down the papaya waste and produce a fuel. Anyway, there's some funding. There's a special purpose revenue bond financing bill for them that's also moving through the legislature. I should leave it at that because there's a lot more bills in here, but if you have particular questions on it, I'd be happy to answer, or if you have particular bills you want me to track, please let me know and I'll do that.
Yeah,
A couple questions. There is, I think, still alive a biosecurity bill that's going
Yes.
through. And what I wanted to ask you, Commissioner David, is if you could take a look at that biosecurity bill, which is a statewide bill under the Department of Ag, and give me or give us your take on it.
Okay.
We'd like to possibly get a request from the mayor to support that bill.
Okay.
The second one is the Senate bill now in the Ishihara's Committee 2347, which is technically it's an invasive species bill.
Yes.
That bill basically is saying that it's slightly discriminatory because it's picking on our floriculture and ornamental industry, and it's figuring us and saying if we get caught with exporting invasive pests from Big Island to Population Center Honolulu, that we are subject to $50,000 to $200,000 fine. And we have to absorb all costs if they can prove it, which is the difficulty, is that if our products are transporting, let's say, fire ant to Honolulu, and that pest gets into public lands, for example, we may have to bear the cost to clean up the public lands. But it says nothing about all other modes of transportation.
That's just nursery stock only.
Yeah, they're fingering primarily nursery and ornamental, which we feel that we are self-policing, so we recognize the problem. We also work with DOA to incorporate into their inspectors how they can not only educate us, but implement inspection and treatment processes that help us to treat our product when we ship into, let's say, population centers of Honolulu or the U.S. mainland, because we are a quarantine state. But it specifically fingers our industry, which we feel that is discriminatory. So we'd like to probably have your take on that too. Now, the danger with this is it can act as an embargo on all export product from Big Island into population center Honolulu. Now, for the amount of volume that the Big Island produces, we're supposedly wrapping up to be the breadbasket of the state. And if they legislate this type of law, it can really hurt our exports of our products shipping into Oahu. So it's not only maybe starting with ornamentals, but it has far-reaching negative consequences for our island supplying Honolulu. And so we're very concerned about that, especially when there's a large land deal, the Galbraith Estate land that is starting on Oahu, and they're going to encourage and probably solicit the best farmers in the state to go on those lands to farm and feed Honolulu. It just seems so coincidental that why come down so hard on neighbor islands and then have promotion of their own lands on Oahu, which is, forgive me for saying, Chair, but very Oahu-centric. And again, we neighbor islands have to be very cautious of this Oahu-centric type of legislation. It's going to start real small, just on ornamentals, and then it can have far-reaching ramifications because they talk nothing about exporting fire ant on equipment, on cars, on pallets, on everything that goes on the barge, but they specifically only refer to ornamentals with a huge fine, $50,000 to $200,000. Basically, in our industry of small nurserymen and women, if you do everything that is possible in the treatment for invasive pests through whether it's P-bark, whether it's CTAR or HARP, the recommendations to the Department of Ag, no treatment is 100% guaranteed. There's nothing 100%. So for a small nurseryman and woman to actually subject themselves to civil penalties, which would take them out of business, naturally what they're gonna stop doing is shipping into population center Honolulu because they don't want the risk. This is the demise of our neighbor island exporting to the population center of Oahu. So again, and I mean, I'm probably going a little bit more than I wanted to, but it's just to emphasize our big concerns that we, you know, not that we really want to protect only the Big Island, but then I think it should be fair legislation. So if you could give us your take on that.
I will certainly do that.
Thank you.
Just curious, that Senate Bill 2347, which is what you've just been referring to, was introduced by the local senator here. Do you know?
We have our concerns. I think it's Senator Josh Green.
Yeah.
We have a lot of concerns with that bill.
And Senator Ruderman signed on too.
Yeah, correct. So we're I think trying to get dialogue going on why they would introduce that type of legislation against our own on the Big Island.
Well, he was asked to do it. He looks like the way he introduced it, he put a BR after it, which means by request of another party. So he's not claiming authorship. So it'd be good to find out who's asked him to do it. But that bill is actually up for public hearing on the 20th.
Yeah, so we are, our industry is specifying, and I know it's kind of a short time frame, so if you could review that, and if you can get back to me in particular, but maybe chair on that.
Well, I could certainly, I mean, I could opine on my take on the bill and send it to Jeff and Dot, and they could share it with the group. But I think all the points you brought up need to be brought up to the committee, and this is going to be heard before the Judiciary Committee in the Senate.
Is it a joint hearing or not? Nishihara's committee and Judiciary?
No, it's already been heard by Ag and the Joint Committee. So that hearing's already happened, and they passed it out amended in a Senate Draft 1. Now it's going to the second referral, the last referral in the Senate, which is a single referral to Judiciary. And that hearing is going to be in 2 days.
Okay.
Yeah, so that'll be on Thursday.
Eric, us guys in the fruit industry would be affected by that as well. You know, and we're not listed, but we're sending hundreds of thousands of pounds of fruit to Oahu. And I would think the papaya industry as well. Got to be ants in there too. And the last thing that we want to do is dip our fruit in poison.
If I may, Chair, the bill, though it's not in front of me, the summary does specify it's only nursery stock. So it is discriminatory in terms of its focus only. But you're right, can't be too far behind is to the other commodities that potentially are hosts.
The big overreaching circumstances would be they would get it through because who cares about floriculture ornamental? It's not ornamental, it's not essential. And yet, once they get that through, they can amend it and come back the following year and apply it to all agriculture from the Big Island or neighborhoods. That is even worse. That's what we really worry about.
If I question about the biosecurity bill, House Bill 1932, it's a biosecurity program appropriating funds for the Department of Agriculture's biosecurity program. Is that the one you're referring to?
I think that's the one.
And that one is now, it passed through agriculture in a House draft, and it's going now to House Finance. And they have not set a hearing date yet. And they've had it for 10 days, or 14 days. They've had it for 2 weeks and they haven't scheduled it yet. So that doesn't always mean something, but it can mean that they're waiting to see how much money is going to be there and how they're going to divvy it up. I mean, that's often what comes.
If I may just take another minute, Commissioner's time. Biosecurity program is so comprehensive, we believe, and we've testified in front of Chair Enright, that it could be the mission of the Department of Ag, because it goes from seed to cup, so to speak. And for the last 2 years, through the past chair and through this chair, new chair now, we just see that biosecurity program has been cubbyholed. There's nothing going on. So all the budget-related issues that were solved by finance committees and agriculture committees, inspectors have not been hired. So the programs cannot be administered if you don't have adequate inspectors. If you don't have programs being administered through biosecurity program, this is one of the big problems why invasive pests are coming up on the radar screen now. It's because the inspectors and the biosecurity program of Department of Ag has been delayed, to say the least. And so we're stressing this to Chair Enright, and we're not getting response. And our industry was getting started 2 years ago with contracts and getting programs and treatment programs for our industry so we could be self-policing and voluntarily administering these programs and treatments to our industry. But without this program, we will not only be the model and a success story, but we were going to roll this out to food crops. Biosecurity can go to food crops next. Without a model for us in place, there's nothing to show the legislature that the money is well spent. So the food crop guys are being held up too. So we don't know why they're not going forward with what we already agreed on, but apparently we don't have a large enough voice. So this is where I think the larger, Farmers and Rancher United or the larger Farmer and Rancher Alliance groups statewide need to probably come together and sit down with Chair Enright and demand actually an answer, because he doesn't answer the questions that we put up. He always says he's going to get back to us, but it's been a year since he's been saying that nothing is happening. So thank you for the time.
Well, I would certainly look into both of those bills and highlight them in future reports and provide any input I can in the next couple of days on the nursery stock export one in particular.
Only one other bill is kind of see if you had a chance to keep track of or see if it's on anywhere. The cottage industry bill.
Oh, yes. That is...
That's still live, basically?
Yes. Yes, it is... Yes, it made it through its first committee, and now it's in its second. It's made it through its first joint committee, and now it's in the second joint committee. And it's Senate Bill 2561. And it permits the cottage food industry in Hawaii, establishing requirements for cottage food operators, operations and food products. Permits Class A cottage food operations to engage in direct sales of these products, and permits Class B operations to engage in direct and indirect sales of these cottage food products, and it defines cottage food products. Sets up a permit system and registration system. And I haven't read the bill, but I think this relates to smaller than a certain volume.
Yeah, I think 150,000.
Oh, so a certain value, not volume. Okay, so a certain value. So it is still alive, Senate Bill 2561. And it's now before a joint committee of Consumer Protection and Ways and Means.
Okay, great.
In the Senate.
Appreciate that update, and I appreciate all the rest of the updates too.
And I'll track those.
Oh, this is just a procedural question, Chair, to think about. As it relates to this committee's desire to be proactive or defensive, encouraging or defensive on these bills, the process of ramping them upstairs to get, to advise the mayor, to ask the mayor for some support or whatever, I think the time to do that is, well, always a very tight little time frames when you meet every month. So, but I think you kind of look for strategic times to do that, but coming up on crossover, if there are things that are particularly important and the group agrees that this would be a useful thing, then we ought to be saying, at this moment in time, here's 3 things we'd really like to see happen, or 2 things we'd really like not to see happen. I mean, Margaret, you've gone through this process a little bit more maybe with the county than I have, but it seems to me that if we want to send that message up to Kevin or whoever is involved in the shaping of certain kinds of mayor's response, Kevin Dayton, that the group has to kind of have a clear picture of what you're trying to accomplish with these updates, because, you know, hearing about them is cool, but acting on them is another thing, and we gotta have a process for doing that. What's your take?
Well, in terms of other committees that I advise, you know, they're advisory to the director, for example, planning director. So this would also have to be vetted through Laverne or Maury. But the mayor's contact person is Clarice, and she may have already submitted testimony. So that might be the first thing, whether it be Jeff or David, to check to see if Jeff could check, because this it might be a moot point, you know. So that would be first, is the bills that you mentioned concern. I would check with her and see if it's already been on the radar.
Cool.
No column.
That's good, and I think that maybe and part of that answer is, it's one thing to go through and get a list of long numbers, it's another thing to say, the group wants to know about this, this, and this. So if the group kind of agrees, these are the 5 bills you need me to follow up, I'll do that.
Yeah.
That's, we need to kind of come up with an action strategy that follows this process, and I think she's absolutely right. First place to start is with Clarice to see where she is on that, and then whether we've done anything or not.
And what I do too, when I get things where other people have submitted testimony, I'll just forward it to her FYI, because it might have been one that they've already done. And there have been situations, for example, the prosecutor had submitted a letter and it was already on the radar. And because they're up on, you know, which one has more of an impact. So.
But the ag one is probably less so. We know that there's a geothermal bill related to ag, and there's a bunch of pieces on that that the administration's been tracking. We know that. But I think some of these other ones, the cottage industry one, the biosecurity conversation, I'm not sure they're in that space. So this is a group who really should be writing those thoughts and helping that group to put the hand on.
I'll go after Marissa.
I think this is a challenge that we come up on every legislative session, is how to quickly.
It's so fast, yeah.
Yeah, because by the time, even if we have a subcommittee that drafts a letter on what our position is, then we have to get it to the mayor's office for them to say, okay, that sounds good, and then somebody's got to get it to a committee that's meeting in 2 days. It's like almost impossible, but I think there is still a lot of value in what you do, David, and that's just my comment. I'm not really, you know, making a suggestion here, but I think all of our commissioners do appreciate the update you provide us, because even if our time constraints don't allow us to go and make a recommendation to mayor, what it does is it allows all the industry people at the table to then go back to their associations like Eric is doing. So there is value in it, and that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with that. Because it's cast laterally and say, hey, this is my practice.
This other part we can still work on if you're willing and able to connect with Clarice or through Jeff or R&D. So I'm not trying to discourage you on that end, but I do want to encourage you that we do appreciate it.
All right. Thanks. I'll keep doing it.
I know you probably like to do it.
I do like it.
That's good.
Any further comment?
Yes, our next meeting is on the 18th, then, is that correct?
Right.
Of March. So at that meeting, we'll know what's already crossed over. And it's the second lateral is going to be just later on that week, on the 20th. So the bills that are alive then, and they're important to us, you know, there's going to be an opportunity for us to make a decision at that meeting on the 18th on a certain, we could pass a motion that says we support this bill for these reasons. That then could be passed on to the mayor or through R&D as just a statement of support or opposition. And we might consider that at our next meeting with the legislative update, that if there are particular ones that, and perhaps some of the ones that we just discussed, that we could have a motion and take action on, and then pass that up the ladder.
Right, that would be the stronger time to do it, because that's when the bills that, you know, they've been filtering them a lot.
That's right.
Okay, I had I guess a question, is there a way to get from Carices, who's already working with the mayor, to put recommendations or, you know, the county's opinions into the state legislation? Is she the point person for that? Would it be possible to get from her any of the recommendations that they're already doing? And
Find out what they're
yeah,
what are their
find out
legislative
so we don't either reinvent the ball, or if they're already commenting on the same comment that we want,
Yeah,
we can
no,
support
that's
it.
great.
If I may, Chair, just if we could ask, what are the legislative priorities of the county
Related to agriculture.
related to agriculture? That would help us know what's already on their radar
Yeah.
screen, and then we could add to it, both in terms of commenting on what's already identified as a priority, and then we could add additional bills that we think should be considered as priorities for agriculture.
So that's just, we can have a conversation on the proposal and
Yeah.
like that. Okay.
And that hopefully can all take place before the 18th, so that we have some idea.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. My gut sense is that there are high-level pieces that are being dealt with across the whole range of legislative actions. Agriculture probably isn't one that's got the high level of penetration, and maybe this is partly the group that's supposed to help think that through. So if there are, the problem with waiting a month in the conversation is that then your opportunity to be for something is less. If something moves on and you're against it, you have more time to come back and focus on it, and, you know, focus. If it's like, you know, the issue Eric was talking about, the ones that you really want to see happen can fall off the table at that point in time. So if there are things that you think are important as a group, then, you know, I would just encourage you to be articulate about it as a group. So I know it's hard to do in this 36 pages of things, to know exactly all the pieces of them, but that would at least, I will go ask Louise what they are following, and I can almost imagine within the first 3 sentences that a conversation, she'll say, what do you guys want to see?
And I would suggest we need to do both. Is that we need to be proactive and tell the administration what we think are priorities so that they can take action on them if they can. But we also want to be in sync with what the administration is doing if there are any ag-related priorities. So we should not be only reactive. You're absolutely right. We do need to be proactive. So I would suggest to the commissioners, take a look at this list. What I can do is I'll send you, let's see, after First Cross, which is March 6th, after the crossover, I'll send a status report to Dot, which she'll then kindly send out to everybody. So then you'll have a new list, a shorter list. Go through that list. Identify what you think are top priority ones, and then spend a little time yourself on the legislative website and, you know, get the bill, look at it, talk to your commodity groups. If it's a priority and you really think that we need to take action on it, come prepared at the next meeting on the 18th with something in mind, you know, a motion and related to a particular bill, and then we can take action on that. If you do have a particular bill that you're going to be wanting to take action on, if you could let the chair know, and then through R&D, I can be informed so that I can have specific information about those bills ready, and then I can speak to them more directly. Because I think that way we can be prepared to take action on the 18th. Okay?
Okay. Let's get some action on the legislation now. Okay.
Good. It's a good conversation. I just want to make sure that we don't just kind of skim over the top of it and do it lightly, because if there are things that are important, we should be on them. I don't know if there are, you know, I don't know much about the coffee issues and what the coffee industry is concerned about in terms of grading, or, you know, and I know there's lots of currents in that stream. But that's one of those who don't know quite where to put your foot in. You know? The biosecurity one, I think, is an important one, particularly the proactive portion of that. moving that money, and you're saying part of that's administrative, it's not so much legislative? Is that what I was hearing you, it's an administrative slowness in implementing pieces? Because that cuts both ways.
Okay, so, I want to check, do we have the microloan proposal to pass that out? Did you sign in?
I did.
On that? You didn't get on the roll call.
That's okay. She's on her. She knows me.
Just-
I'm Carrie. Hi, everybody.
Hi, welcome back.
Hey, everybody.
Okay, so the update which I have on the microloan program is I talked to people that asked them if they had a way to work with counties. They're, just by chance, a person who's, medium high up in it happens to have been inquiring and likes the island, so he has a little bit better feel for them. He says that they're willing to put a point person on to work with the county or to create meetings to make it happen, and that they can facilitate pretty much most of the decision making, as far as whatever we tell them to do, they'll do. If we say it's got to be done big on, if we say it's got to be agriculture, they just say, okay, that's the rules, and they follow. They do it more mechanically. Whatever we tell them to do is what they'll do. Talking about them a little bit more in depth, if the program does, if we decide to go with it, the program does get implemented, the county will commit funds for like 5 years, odds are that they would get like almost 35% of those funds back. The default rate has been 13%, so they could put the money in and get it back again. And it could be a place that could be used for a lot of the smaller scale, which is the scale which I'm on, a lot of the flower people being on the same scale. These are scales of $2,500 loans, $5,000, up to about $20,000. And the county would be able to leverage the money really well with it. So what I'd like to do is, you just got it, so you don't have a chance to really look at this. But what I'd like to do is kind of get a sense from the commission if it's an idea that we should go forward with. I'd like to say if it is, then I'd like to go ahead and, pass it to the mayor and say, is this something you want us to pursue a little bit further? And it's fairly well flushed out now. We could add conditions or, if something comes up, we could add it before we actually commit any money to it. So I think I've described it, in previous meetings, that, the basics of it and how it's working, and how it's worked for my own personal farm. But I see it as a good way to do two things. One is to leverage county money, then directly to small growers or anyone who wants up to about 20,000, incubate them. And then when a lot of people come up and there's like ideas that might be off the wall, you sit there and say, well, we're not going to decide whether your idea is off the wall or not. We're going to let the group process that the Kiva does decide that. If they can't get funding, 90% of the funding from other people, well, your idea just didn't fly. Underlying that, though, there's another thing which I think could be created, and that is if we really try and have the growers participate and people who loan come from the big on, to create a long-term network of people that actually is a community building thing, where they'd be loaning to each other in a sense, but still getting money from outside the county totally, and outside the county funding structure. The county would just be kind of, helping catalyze it.
Well, I think it's a wonderful idea. It's innovative. It's something different from what we've been able to have available for financing for farmers getting started. I don't know if we've addressed all the
structural issues, for example, within the county, and that would be one I'd like to get clear on, is there a statutory authorization for county funds to be used in this manner? Even if it's only, a small percentage of the loan, can we use county money for a loan program like this? And I just don't know whether there's any sort of statutory authorization for that. And I won't put Margaret on the spot to ask her, since it probably takes some research to figure it out.
Yes, and probably at a minimum talk to finance.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, we wouldn't necessarily know in R&D, but,
So I would think that would be an important
That'd be
initial step to validate that there is existing statutory authority to use county funds in a loan program. And if there isn't, then obviously we would have to get statutory authority, and that would be something that the mayor or the administration would have to initiate through the council. But in general, I think it's great if we come up with other financing mechanisms for farmers, then it's needed. I would encourage us to pursue it. Thanks.
Any comments? So I guess, would the right thing from here be to go ahead and try and run it past the mayor? Mike can probably talk to him directly and just say, is this something you'd like us to pursue, or use this as a basis? Is this something that we'd like to find out from statutory regulation, find out what we have to do to do it, or, basically see what his interest level is.
Do you want to run it by the mayor first, or do you want to run it by finance first to make sure you have any
almost,
obstacles?
Well, almost like run it by the mayor just to see whether he wants us to, he even likes the idea at all, because if it doesn't, then why make everyone run around all over the place? It's not a, it doesn't mean it's going to approve it as is, it just means it's an idea that he'd like us to pursue.
I have a suggestion, Chair. I can see both perspectives of running it by finance first, and then your perspective of, well, I talk to the mayor, because if he's not interested, then I won't even bother the finance people. But I think for the folks that are going to have to implement it, because I'm thinking the mayor's going to think it's a good idea, but I think the people at finance would probably appreciate if you spoke to them first to find out what the obstacles are, because rather than if you go to the top and, oh, this is a great idea, guys, figure it out, then they go, oh, okay.
the staffing
Yeah,
situation.
on the staff side. So it might be
That's a
worth
good point.
running it by finance
Okay,
first.
so.
Because then if it is going to be a program they administer, they feel like they've been part of it from the beginning to you.
Okay, so definitely.
And then when you talk to the mayor, you can say, well, this is what finance said from X, Y, and Z, or you might be able to figure out what you might need to work on before you propose it.
Okay, so then do we need a proposal or something to send it that way, or have?
I can bring, what you put on your agenda for next time, and I can bring back a response on the topic. Here's another way to think about that. We have an ongoing supplemental funding program, right, that we annually have. We will issue again in April and run for the next fiscal year. The top amount is about $25,000 that you could get for any particular program. Now, if a nonprofit organization, call it farmer union or somebody, if we can figure out a way to do this in a legal way, that kind of process we might be able to do it with an intermediary. In other words, that intermediary submitted a proposal in the competitive grant program. We have money to put into a joint loan program that had X, Y, Z kinds of criteria. That's just, it's separate from the mayor writing a check or the council, the county writing a check, but it's done through a program process. I'm not suggesting that's the way to do it. I'm just saying that I'm just trying to broaden the view of different ways where that might be able to happen. And the first start is, I would agree with Marissa, is to start with where are the hurdles of finance. And then the next question is it something the county would do itself, or would it be part of a grant program through the,
program in Cali that they use, they help farmers a lot. It's in the same building as Public Defender. They do programs like that, but it's Diane Lay, I know.
yeah, the farm Farm Service?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a possibility. There are other organizations that could broker that kind of thing. The Koala Center is putting together a microloan initiative that they're trying to, that they have a couple of other kinds of investors in. They could be an applicant to that thing and put it into that piece. Somebody from, I'm just talking off the top of my head, but the Farmers Union could say, maybe we make an application, see if we can put it into this Kiva program. There are a variety of different initiatives out there. The question is, can you leverage some public funds in some limited way to help farmers get a small asset that they could build over time?
And plus, whoever initiates, whoever lends the money is where the money returns to, because it's money that you're actually spending multiple times. Any of those things that you suggested, I'd be supportive of, whichever channels will make it work. What I'd like about it, if you can do it directly with the county government, is that when those funds return, they have a clean way to reuse the funds and reallocate it if our priorities change, or if it's working, to expand it. Because I'm just focused on the agriculture because that's my interest, but the organization actually focuses on all small businesses.
So if we want to follow that model, then what would have to be set up is a revolving fund that is specifically authorized to be used for loans. And then when the money is repaid, it goes back into the revolving fund and is used again. Now that's going to require specific statutory authorization, and probably nothing that's already set up, which is not an insurmountable barrier, but it's important to know that that would be necessary. So in the conversation with finance, there are models at the state level. There's, Safe Drinking Water Revolving Fund. There's a bunch of revolving funds that the state legislature has set up that loans money to projects and then they get repaid. This may be something that the county would have to do, is set up a revolving fund specifically for farm loans, of a certain amount, and then the money, when it's paid back, would have a place to go, so it could be reused.
Would that be county level law then?
It could be. I'm not familiar enough with the county code to know how it's structured with revolving funds, and so I can't really answer that question. But certainly there's a model of the state. I just don't know the county code well enough to know whether there's revolving funds there.
I would just add to that, I think there's a value in walking before you run. And if there's a way to test the concept of its utility and its, in a way that we could see if it works, then you could go in, if it's successful, then you could go into the process of rebuilding a bureaucratic structure to allow that to happen and, pass those bigger laws. But if there's a means that you could get to a circumstance that says, we did this with 25, this resulted in this money rebuilt itself, kept going, now could we be involved in that? That's another question. One of the problems with creating that revolving fund is the administrative weight of small transactions and the fact that that's really not the hallmark of county finance management. So there may be maybe others that are more efficient to do that. So anyway, I'm just saying that there's a way to do this maybe in a step and then see if you could build it into something.
Yeah, what it would be is basically outsourcing all that weight, all that paperwork, all that stuff gets outsourced to a nonprofit, basically.
Unless you do what you're talking about, which is the revolving fund, which revolves internally.
No, if
That's
we
what I
have
was
to
thinking.
rebuild it, I think it's hard to do. So the next step would be, or a step would be to look at the financial department, see if there's any authority for it as it exists, or see where it sits as far as being authorized.
May I suggest, Chair, that we actually form a, what do we call it, a committee, a ad hoc committee or something, where not a standing committee, but an ad hoc committee that would include you, Chair, and maybe one other, that then would be able to go and talk to finance, because they're going to need some explanation. And then find out from them what's their reaction. And then that committee could come back to tell us on our next meeting, here's the results of it, here's what looks like it's a possibility, and then you could recommend to the commission
how we should move forward. But it gives you and the committee the authorization from the commission to go and actually meet with them and have that conversation, and then come back to the commission with a recommendation for next step.
And
I think that,
and R&D can set that up, meeting
You
up.
can set it up if you're in town. If you're not, we could do it at a staff level and bring that back, and you can bring, or we could do it with that.
we just in terms of how we handled it before, I remember when you were on a committee, Marissa, with Steve Bowles, it was with R&D. R&D set up the meetings with the agencies. The committee members met, I'm not sure, with R&D staff and
I don't think
Public
our
Works.
staff would attend.
Okay, so it's just, so R&D set it up. They may or may not want to attend, but it's all done through R&D. The meeting was set up through R&D between the committee and the other agency. And if R&D staff wanted to be there, great. But I think it was all done through R&D so that we maintain proper protocol.
That sounds like will give us, keep momentum going on.
Yes.
And I think a couple of people said, "Oh, this is an instant thing. This is what we have to do." But if it works really well. And okay, so do we need to have a proposal we can have?
Yeah, then you want to do it now? I certainly would move to form a committee, an ad hoc committee on the microloan proposal.
Okay. Guess any further discussion on that? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing all, the motion is passed. And I guess we can form,
You have to identify.
who wants to go
Excuse me, you have to identify exactly who's gonna be on the committee
Yes.
first.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
next.
So-
Bob, you want, does anyone else want to participate?
I'll help you out.
Okay, I'm sure that's fine.
Great.
I think,
Thank you.
I think this part's taken care of, Zip is taking care of most of it. I think the most important part is going to be probably meeting with finance and setting up the meetings to find out how can we regulatory allows. So between us, I don't think there's not much more that we can do. We might do a phone call or a couple of emails, I think.
Great, so if we could make sure to have on our next agenda a report from this committee with recommendations for next steps on the microloan proposal.
Okay.
And then I think R&D will get, work with finance and communicate with you both.
Okay.
What I'm hearing though is that, that we can set up a meeting, because you folks want to be involved in the meeting, so we can set up a time when it's either, Troy can come down, and you can join us on the phone or something, but we'll sit down with Jeff, probably Jeff Dansel purchasing, or I'm not sure who. We can
You
figure it out.
can figure out who to meet with.
Yeah, right.
We'll get it, we'll figure it out and we'll get the right people at the right table.
Right, and we can do it by phone, so even if you're not there, Troy can come down and join us in a conversation.
Yeah, I think we did by phone. I think, the preliminary should be, let's get the idea on the table and let's see, what we need to work with it, And then we still need to make sure the mayor's interested in it on top of that.
Right. But keep in mind, there may be ways to do this outside of that formality. And that would be another thing to test with finances. Is there a reason why if somebody came and this is a nonprofit and wanted to have this money to help feed into a loan program that had this kind of structure, would that, where are the hurdles? But I can see that actually being a much faster way to make something
Yes.
like that happen.
Revolving funds are cumbersome, and any time you create a new fund, a special fund or revolving fund, it always raises questions from decision makers, as they should, because it ties up money and it commits it for future council, and there's always a reluctance to do that. But I think that's what you can find out.
We try to simplify the process as much as possible.
Yes, thank you, Troy. We need that.
Okay, yes, so any other committees that you want to request for submission list? Any other committees that people be interested in forming? Okay, and we're looking for the next government or public officials. I think we're looking at seeing if we're gonna have, the building person, at the next meeting, maybe we've gone some of the, that's the main one we talked about right now, then we get you all to come back and discuss a draft at the next meeting.
Did you want, I think her name was Clarice, would that be appropriate to ask her to do it like a verbal update with us on what the county's legislative initiatives are?
She's too busy.
Okay.
Well, maybe if we were meeting on that side and knows a specific set of things, she might, but I would say, I would agree with Margaret, she's swamped.
Okay.
But we do,
So not
but
in person, but we'll get it.
yeah, I can sit with Clarice, I do on a couple of other projects, so we can talk about that. And,
Could you inform me about any priorities that she tells you that are ag-related?
I can do that.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
So,
Okay. But yeah, I think with her, she just lets us know if she is active on any ag issues, we're just kind of not going to reinvent the deal, basically, kind of do. I guess the next thing would be, is there any other new business items that someone has they want to put on to the next meeting?
Yes, Chair. You know, there was an article this morning about Don Thomas's work on characterizing the aquifer up in the Saddle. There's Mike isn't here today, but Department of Hawaiian Homelands has a huge project plan for their lands in Humula, right? That could be facilitated or enabled by groundwater that's easily accessible. I think it would be very interesting at some future meeting, not necessarily the next one, that we ask Mike to give us a briefing on what the Humula plan is. I mean, it's a big plan, and it potentially could have some, great new opportunities. But it's only enabled if you got water. I mean, Manly Schools is very knowledgeable about this situation where you've got land and no water, right? But anyway, I don't know if you saw the reports from Don Thomas, and they're characterizing that aquifer, and I was very,
pretty deep.
very excited. Well, there's one at 500, there's another one at 700, another one at what, 1800 or something. So I mean, if there is water, if it's sufficient supply, there's a lot of ifs. But I think it would be important for the commission at least to get some idea. And that was the first thing I was going to talk about is DHHL's plans for Humula. It'd be good for us to know what those are. And then sometime, it would be really nice to have an idea about the future agricultural plans for Kamehameha Schools. Just because you're such a major landowner here, that it would be really helpful for the commission to know what your plans are so we can be supportive of it when it's appropriate. So these are just ideas for future meetings.
Not necessarily next meeting, but.
Not necessarily our next meeting, but future meetings so we understand more about those two particular large landowners. I have another major landowner representative right here next to us with Troy, and that was, so I was going to ask for at a future meeting, of the Ed Olson Trust. It's got a lot of land, a lot of great ideas and plans. It would be helpful for our commission to have a good sense of what these ag plans are for these large landowners, so that we can be informed and be helpful if it's appropriate.
Okay.
And just to add to that, I think at our last meeting we did talk about Mike Robinson being willing to do a forestry update, and Troy volunteered to do a map industry update. So we also have those specific pieces, not necessarily landowner, VHHL for Mike and Olson Trust for Troy, but on industry stuff we've also.
Yes.
And also how that macadamia industry status is related to the House Bill of 1931, the public hospital. That's a big one for us.
Say that again?
The 1931, House Bill 1931 is prevention and studying for taking care of the felting toxin in macadamia in that orchard, specifically down Kau, where it's really, really bad. But
the disease is already here,
yes, it is, in a big way.
and its impact has been.
Well, it actually kills trees eventually, or it will reduce your
your harvest totals real drastically very quickly. It's a scale insect and it's hard to control. So that's a big bill for us.
I guess it's two different ways of approaching it. One is a commodity presentation, which is very important. Academia, for example, in forestry. I was coming at it from a slightly different perspective, I was looking at the landowner and speaking it from that perspective. I'd be very open to, we need to learn about the commodity groups, issues, and priorities. But I also think there's such a major impact of what these ag plans are for large landowners that it'd be helpful for us to at least know that. So let's spread these out over future meetings whenever the presenters are available.
Just a comment, as we're talking about large ag lands, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Kona Community Development Plan that was implemented into law, but evidently there's some issues now that if people are wanting to, how do you say, subdivide or rezone, right? Because of the plan, there's certain things that needs to be either done concurrently or done first before anything can happen. And evidently it's a fairly major issue because it's actually stopped some of the development because people can't put in the infrastructure before getting the zoning, so to speak. So I think it's important as we look, especially in the Kona district, how does that work, right, in the development plan? And Kona, I think right now is the only one that's on the front line at this point. So there's no development or rezoning or anything like that is being planned because people don't know where it's at.
Well, I wouldn't say no, none, there are some going before the planning commission, but it's, yeah, they definitely need to consult with the planning department on that.
Okay, and I'm not sure, I'm just, that's my observation too, Margaret, if I'm wrong, but that as it relates to the Kona Ag Belt and Coffee Belt, part of the direction of the plan was not to see a lot of development, but that was part of the intention, and that development would happen in the North Kona core. And that was really generally supported by the ag community as a whole, that that's what they wanted to see happen. And that the requirement of those development, and particularly in the ag center, was that lands would be clustered and there would be, you know, large areas remaining rather than to cut everything up into 3 to 5 acre lots. That it would be smaller, that they would still have large areas to farm. So that was part of the ag story, and I think part of what I'm hearing your comments apply a lot in the urban core.
Yeah,
So
North Kona,
it's in the
not
North
necessarily
Kona,
South
urban
Kona,
core.
yeah, that's true.
And not even the Malka North Kona. It's,
Yeah.
This is really the K to K, Kailua to Keaole kind of core area.
Okay.
And I think Eric was going to make you had a conversation about the flower industry as well.
Yeah, I'm working with Kelvin Siwaki, who's our UAC representative. Please. I'm not as ambitious as Tim's. I was really impressed with Tim's last time, so that asked me to go do something with Kelvin, but I don't think I can be as historic, but at least I can give us a snapshot, quick and dirty one, at least to give the commission at least an idea. So I'm trying to see if I can get it done by next month. Not by the end of February, but probably by March. I think I can try and get something done.
Okay, well, so we could put that at the end of the March meeting, and if it works, and if it doesn't, slot down a little further.
Okay.
And yeah, I think that, you know, we'll see how much, we'll keep this is going to be on our minutes, and then we can bring up what we need, you know, to put on the agenda in future meetings. Most of this isn't have to be next meeting sort of stuff. Except
You
for
want to
the
recap?
let's see, we got a lot. Yes, we had updates from Mike on forestry, we had future plans from Columbia schools, we had 20 community development plan, looking a little bit at HB 1931, looking at the Hamua plan.
DHHL is Umuhula.
Hamua plan. So I think, you know, we're going to try and catch a little bit out of it. The next meeting, the dates will be
March 18th.
March 18th.
Okay.
And Hilo.
Hilo.
What about the agenda item?
What?
The agenda item specifically for this, just I just want to know if you wanted to identify right now, any, from this discussions, if there's any,
The main thing we should discuss on the agenda for this discussion would be to put on the, for us.
okay.
Well, there's also the update, we want us to invite Neil Erickson to come and talk on that process, right? So that was a certainty, and then I have a response back from their feedback on the microloan finance conversation, and report back on the legislative issue. In terms of other priorities.
You're going to do an update on the GMI too, just again.
And I'll still keep you updated on the carryover on the registration process.
Yeah, definitely keep the GMO farmer registration program on the agenda so we keep getting those updates.
Okay, yes, is there a motion for adjournment? All in favor?
Aye.
Okay,
Thank you.
Meeting now adjourned. Often.
And did everyone see the Wine Airlines magazine?
With his hands there.
With his hands blowing the cinnamon?
Cinnamon.
He's growing cinnamon.
What, this month?
Yeah?
Yeah, that's all on the lines right now.
Please help yourself to some food.
You have a copy of it?
Thank you, Dad.
I haven't actually seen the